Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. So, welcome to our panel. This is the Financing and Business Development panel for AR and VR. My name is Joe Michaels, and I'm your moderator, and I'm very excited. Hello, camera. Very excited to have you all here today to hear from a terrific panel of people. We have a couple of scratches on the program, so some of the people who are listed in the program you won't see, but we have an incredible group of people who are here, and can't wait to get started. The way that we're going to work the panel is straightforward. We'll do a few introductions, and I'll fire a bunch of questions at these folks and put them on the hot seat. And we'll try to leave some time at the end for question and answer in case you all have some burning questions. I hope you'll be thinking of some good ones for a group this talented and experienced. So my name's Joe Michaels. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of Axon VR. If you haven't heard of us, we're a pretty quiet company providing realistic haptics. We say that we are virtual reality you can feel. If you're interested in haptics, I'd love to talk to you after the panel. I'm going to ask the person right next to me, Mike, to introduce himself briefly and tell you sort of where he fits into the VR and AR world.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Hildebrandt. I run corporate development and strategic partnerships for Dacry. Dacry is an AR technology company, so we're solely focused in the AR space. We have two core technology paths that we develop around. That's display technologies and computer vision. We work to productize those technologies, first with our first hardware, which will be available in mass on November 1st, the Dacry Smart Helmet, which is focused towards the enterprise and use cases for solving process problems and other industrial use cases. We've got also a heads-up display that we focus on large OEM car manufacturers. And it's our second product line, which is in over 200,000 Jaguar Land Rovers. Currently, it's an entirely holographic display, cool. And I think the future of display technology. So something we're very excited about and excited to have productized already.
So hello, everyone. I'm Kayvon Paimani. I'm a venture capitalist. So I guess I'm the investor on the panel for now. We look after the interest of large corporations. So we help manage and run the corporate venture function for several large companies. And feel free, we can connect afterwards, and I'll be happy to tell you more about that. We're pretty excited about what's happening in VR and AR in particular, and then the kind of content space as well as the industrial side and use cases that we're seeing emerge. So happy to dive into all of those things. And I come from the operator universe.
Hi, I'm Jake Carlson. I'm with Manat Digital. Manat Digital is a division of Manat Phelps and Phillips, which is a leading national law firm. They started our group about 3 years ago to address needs of their clients and kind of a gap in the marketplace. So we do digital strategy, which is messaging and positioning, go-to-market strategies, monetization, customer acquisition. We also do M&A, so we do pre-transaction target identification, due diligence, and post-transaction integration. We also do business development work, so target identification again, putting people in touch with the right players for strategic partnerships or investment. And our kind of one of the nice things about our practices, our legal and our consulting groups are integrated. So, we're kind of a one-stop shop for, your full needs. We focus in the Manat digital space on digital media and frontier technology. So, we have clients that run the gamut from startups to the big studios and everywhere in between.
Excellent. So I'm sure if you all have been reading the news, you've been seeing the headlines over the past week or so. They keep getting better and better and bigger and fluffier and frothier. And last week Citibank released a report talking about a $1 trillion market within the next number of decades. That's a T. And then on a smaller scale, but not any less interesting, there was a great headline from the Hollywood Reporter this week that said, two major film directors, I think they said Spielberg and Inarritu, are they think VR is actually going to make money, as if that's news, and in a way it is. So there's a ton of activity. Maybe we're out over our skis a little bit because there's maybe more hype than actual business being done at the moment. But let's sort of start with that. What are you guys seeing in the market right now in terms of financing? What kinds of deals are getting done? Is it more AR, more VR? Anyone just tell us what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, well, from a content standpoint, actually our firm just represented Sony in one of the first VR slate deals for content. Reality One, which is Jay Pritzker's company, has invested in a whole VR slate of content with Sony, which is really exciting because that kind of legitimizes VR and where it's going. We're seeing an influx of cash from a number of different players globally, and we really think that this is, we're very bullish on the market. I think we need to see adoption of the hardware, but content's going to drive that. So seeing the money come in for content production is great.
Yeah, I'd broaden it out. I mean, we're seeing investments pretty much across the gamut, from industrial use cases to content-driven use cases. It's no secret. It's well over $1 billion just this year alone. A lot of the investments are, it's still pretty early days in both sides of the VR AR side, and we tend to talk about it in one breath as VR AR. And I think that over time, that's probably going to be true, that it's really going to be this kind of mixed reality universe. A lot of the investments we're looking at tend to be either hardware plays that are looking for content, or content studios trying to figure out how to approach this new kind of immersive medium, and then the gamut that runs in between them. So when you look at the taxonomies of it, there are several sectors getting funded. The long and short of it is that every sector of VR and AR right now is getting funding, and it is a very, very hot sector because of that.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I think VR hardware is easier, which is what allows the content to be more mature in that space. The hardware for AR is much more difficult to pull off. Takes longer development times. It's going to take an evolution of technologies, and I think the content will follow. Personally, the reason DAQRI is focused on the enterprise is because the type of content you need to have a successful AR device on a factory floor is different than what you need for a consumer. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think the funding sort of looks that way. We don't see a lot of funding paths for AR content, but we do for AR technologies, core technologies that'll make that market more realistic.
What about AR content? Would you agree? I mean, he's Mike and DAQRI are very industrial focused areas right now. What about, are you seeing any AR content? I mean, Pokemon Go is the big kind of AR content spear, a tip of the spear. Is there anything else that you all are seeing out there?
Yeah, we're seeing, particularly in the game sector, there are companies that kind of skirt the AR line. I mean, you can actually argue that Pokemon Go is much more a location-based entertainment tool than anything else. But no, I agree with Mike. I mean, there's AR looks to be the sector that's going to have the most interesting long-term impact in terms of all of the various industry sectors that are going to be able to use AR in really interesting ways, from augmented surgeries to interesting pathways during industrial manufacturing processes. And so we are looking at that space very closely, but that is a very hard problem, right? Whenever you're overlaying the not real against the real, you have to solve a lot of issues that you don't have to solve when you put on the dark glasses and are transported into a world that you've completely created. However, VR obviously still has some of the same issues it's had over the last couple of years around things like motion sickness and others that are getting better. The net is that they're both pretty early on, right? It's we're seeing experiments in the AR content side really from the standpoint of things like navigation, some like game uses, some light industrial uses, but it really is companies like Daiquiri and Meta and HoloLens and all these other guys that are getting much deeper into that.
The one caveat I think I would throw on there is education. I think I've seen a lot of good AR for education.
I agree.
I don't know that there's a clear path to monetizing that, but I do think that it has an inherent value. A lot of what we do at Daiquiri is work inspections or training that is just another form of education. It's another form of transferring knowledge from an individual to another. So I do think that when you look at the classroom, the ability for AR to speed learning up or challenge people in different ways is pretty interesting.
I think the digital health space is also an interesting area. You know, you were seeing some funding in that area, but again, I think there's a long-term play here. It's not stuff that's in the market right now, but you know, companies that are developing really interesting tech that could have a lot of use cases down the road. So.
I'm amazed we said AR and no one mentioned Magic Leap. That's one of those, you know, kind of mysteries of the universe right now. Does anyone have any knowledge they want to share about where Magic Leap is at the moment?
If you did, could you?
Probably not.
It's very cool. How's that?
I think it's great for the industry in one aspect. It's also dangerous in another. You know, if they never come to market with product, it's a lot of money burnt on something that is a great theory. And so I think as an industry, you have to be worried about that. You don't want to repeat a VR boy and what happened to the VR industry. But at the same time, I think, you know, as an industry, we all root for them to be successful because failure for them is a worse outcome for everybody than success.
Are they too big to fail?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Let's talk about geography for a minute. We're in LA, really the sort of the locus of I would say VR and AR investment in a way. But you've got a lot of money coming from China. You have a lot of money coming from the Bay Area and even Seattle, where I'm from. So I'm curious, where is the money flowing from that you're seeing, and what are some of the benefits or disadvantages of getting money from one place over another right now?
I mean, we're definitely seeing a lot of activity from China, and there are pros and cons with that. You know, pros being there's a lot of money there, and I think there's a lot of interest because just the scale from China's standpoint is incredible. So they're already doing a lot of stuff over there that's already in the market. But the cons, you know, there are risks with taking Chinese money, you know, in terms of how that cash flow happens. And what the overall goals are of the Chinese company versus the receiving company. So, but we have seen a lot of activity, and hopefully it'll keep continuing.
I agree with that sentiment. I think there's a lot of money coming from China, but I've seen New York pop up recently. More so, I think they're starting to take VC a little bit differently.
In what way?
I think they're being more aggressive, right? There's more money being put into kind of traditional VC funds that are looking for earlier stage companies. I think there's more development happening now in the New York area and the East Coast than there was in the past, and that's helping kind of fund that. I wouldn't say that it's overwhelming the market in any way, but certainly it's more than it was, 5 years ago, 6 years ago when Daiquiri started.
Someone made an interesting point to me about China. It was a woman I met here at this conference in the spring, and we've stayed in touch, and she said China really is ahead in many ways, and in other ways it's not. In other words, it's ahead in the usage. If you read about the way China is using VR, they're less likely to use it in their homes. They're less likely to be to be sort of sitting around a couch with their friends and that kind of thing. But they're very likely to be out in cafes using the internet, which is morphing into VR. And so they're certainly way ahead in terms of bringing VR into the public sphere and social usage in public spaces. But if you look at sort of the key innovations, they're all coming out, most I would say are coming out of the US and to an extent maybe Taiwan, but it's just fascinating that, that you can have a whole region that's so far ahead in terms of how it's being applied, the technology, versus another region like the West, which is really farther ahead in terms of funding and innovation and imagining what's possible. Would you agree or disagree? I mean, that's maybe a provocative statement.
I think we don't know enough about what's happening in that market globally, right? It's certainly it's true that the brand names that are going after VR are outside of that territory. But in terms of the R&D that's happening through the university systems and through other parts of that ecosystem, I don't think that we on the kind of more consumer side of VR, AR, and mixed reality have enough insight into that kind of pipeline. The other comment I would make is that this goes back to kind of your comment of funding. It's VR and AR are very research intense kind of things, right? It's different than the app economy that kind of has preceded it. And so by its very essence, you just need large pools of capital that are exploring how to do this. And so it's not a surprise that we're seeing the global brands like the Samsungs of the world diving into it, because they have vertical ecosystems that can benefit from actually developing the hardware and the contents and all of the other kind of tool sets that go along with it. Whereas in Silicon Valley, they're more able to pick off bits and pieces of that supply chain, to use that kind of terminology, and fund it in a way that is not as funded in other territories. So I think that comment is much more to do with the way in which technology development happens in the U.S., with the caveat that I can vividly remember 3 or 4 years ago where it seemed like every week I was running across a Chinese company with 100 million users I've never heard of, right? That no one's ever heard of, not just we've never heard of. That was never been in media. That's been stealth until they got to that size. So I would never say that there isn't some incredible VR hardware company being developed in China. I would just say we probably don't know that it is.
Yes, I think there's a great opportunity for information sharing between China and the U.S., considering how far ahead they in many ways they really are. I'm hopeful that something that we'll see in later 2016, early 2017 is more of an information flow on that. Let's talk for a minute about while we're on the topic of financing, VCs versus strategic investors. We have someone on the Touchdown Ventures, side who really focuses on strategic investing, and we have others who are more maybe directly involved with venture capital. Can anyone sort of talk about where is money coming from these days? Is it VC? Is it strategic? Obviously, it's both. But what are sort of the benefits and disadvantages of going with one or both of those parties for funding?
I guess I can talk about the strategic side. I mean, the reason that I am at Touchdown, the reason that we do what we do is there's a pretty amazing ability for large companies to add actual scale to a startup if they partner in the right way. And right way means if they're able to actually be first client, for market penetrator, layer IP on top of it, do something from a partnership and biz dev standpoint that gives some strategic advantage to this startup vis-a-vis its other partners. And so I have a very strong feeling that when you think about what the corporate side of the venture capital universe does well, they do it well when that part of the statement is true, when they're actually strategic as an investor. The venture capital side of it, I mean, venture capital is a game of power laws, right? It's really a business of finding that one unique thing that's going to make all of the returns of your fund. And so the lens at which you use when you're talking about venture capitalists, the pure lens is what is the actual financial impact going to be in the long run? What are the potential exits going to be? What are the pathways to success that this company has that don't rely on the strategic investor coming through with whatever it is that the business development side happens?
Let's go with that first point you made about strategic investors and how some do it the right way and some maybe don't. Any examples you can think about good strategic investment? Yeah.
Well, I mean, when you think about what Sapphire Ventures has done, I would say that their returns are on par with any investor in the world. And they do a pretty remarkable job of looking at the kinds of investments that the SAP universe could actually push, right? Comcast Ventures I'd put up there, which a nod to my two co-founders who founded Touchdown. Certainly Disney has done it in times with their accelerator and companies like Sphero. Intel has done it as well. Like there are several corporations out there that have strategic venture arms that have great financial returns. It's not strategic to lose money. You do have to have an eye to that, but are also able to somehow rally the mothership on behalf of this startup and make that partnership actually bear some fruit. So there are examples of that, but admittedly, last year alone there were 85 new ones that sprung up. There's well over 1,200 of them that exist now. Arguably, there weren't 1,200 seasoned venture capital teams out there. So I think there is a bit of a gap of understanding how to put a real venture capital process against that side of the business. Venture capitalists do actually have skills, right? And they do actually look at deals in a specific way. And it's important for corporate venture capitalists to be as diligent as their counterparts in the industrial side.
Does Dacry have experience with raising VC and or strategic capital? I'm curious what your experience with that is.
Yeah, we do. We've been blessed to be funded by a family office here in Southern California, and so we've had the advantage of not having to go to market repeatedly. And benchmarking ourselves along the way. It's given us the freedom to develop, to make acquisitions, to have capital at our fingertips to do things. We get approached by strategics all the time. Our customers are very interested in what we do. There's a lot of advantages to partnering with a company at the stage where we're at, where we have hardware that's usable and can be scaled. So there's I think value in that. We look at strategic partnerships from a wide range of varieties. They don't always involve investment, but they most certainly involve that kind of exclusivity in return for access to scale, right? And that's the value that we look for when we identify a partner.
Just out of curiosity, could we have a raise of hands of people in the audience that have raised funding before? Anyone else who plans to raise funding potentially in the future? Wow, that is okay. So that's a common activity out there, which is a good thing. Okay, and and then hold in your mind some of the questions you may have, for these folks about their experiences. I really hope they can help. But I want to talk for a minute about projects. So how stuff that's getting funded. When I was consulting earlier this year, and I would go to companies and say, "Hey, let me help you with business development," and I said, "How do your projects get funded?" This is VR and AR content projects. Everyone kind of looked at each other like, "We're not really sure. We're not really sure how we get things funded right now." There's sort of deficit financing you can do. There's you can brand integrations in the content. You can look for content exclusives, rare sort of exclusives. I'm just kind of curious, what are you seeing in terms of how projects get funded right now and get off the ground?
It's the same answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you just went through this, so maybe you could highlight some of that.
Sure, yeah. So, well, from a content standpoint, it kind of runs the gamut, depending on what the property or the team is and what they're looking to do. We have a client who's a major producer, creator, who's made some of the most incredible characters in print and movie history, and looking to enter the VR space. And a lot of the people that we've spoken with are interested in maybe like a headset manufacturer or somebody that needs content for their platform and are willing to put the money up front for the production and then do a rev split after that. Obviously, branded content and sponsored content. There's a lot of promo material coming out of the studios in support of films and things like that. I think the new John Wick VR experiences can be pretty sweet. But that's all short-term monetization efforts for the content creators. I think in the long term, there's going to be more focus on non-endemic brands and sponsors who are going to get involved in funding some of these activities in reaching a certain demographic or a certain type of experience that helps promote who they are. But yeah, for content, you get creative. I mean, like any good producer, you're going to find where the money is, and whatever it takes to get your project off the ground, you're going to find a way to do it.
Yeah, I will say, by and large, it's true that if you're a content-focused company, you're not getting venture capital, institutional venture capital dollars, right? It's institutional venture capitalists tend to look for platforms and technologies that they understand that will scale, and content businesses tend to be very individualistic, meaning it's the writer, director, producer, whatever team it is that's putting that together. Mm-hmm. So if you are a content business, your primary sources of funding are not going to come from institutional venture capital. They may come from strategic venture capital, right? There are studios and networks and newspapers and a whole host of companies that have content and IP and brands and characters that are looking for new places to exploit those characters or new audiences to approach. And so there is a universe where your project is interesting enough to strategic that they might want to be a part of it. But it's as hard getting money from that side of the business as it is getting it from the film or TV network side of the business, right? So it's you have to have something unique if you're a content play.
And yet, some of the announcements this week and in recent months have been of new studios popping up and attracting some investment. Baobab Studios, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, just announced a big round. The virtual reality company did a big round. So I know that some studios are able to convince investors that they have something special, whether it's the talent or some kind of thesis about how their content
That's
works.
actually a good point. It's so there is a caveat around what stage you're talking about, right? So at the earlier stages, you may have a venture capitalist with the capital VC institutional side take a flyer on the team that's in front of them, right? And you know, guys like Baobab that have people from Google and DreamWorks and Yahoo and engineers and other things, they may look at that and say, you know what, it is a studio, but it's got an incredible tech team. If anyone can figure it out, it must be these guys, right? And so you will find those kinds of pockets. It is individual, it is round specific, but there are going to be very few of these content studio models that attract large institutional venture.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is the hardware makers themselves have to develop ecosystems.
Yeah.
And so they've got to put capital up to get people to contribute to that. And so you see what HTC is doing, you see what Valve is doing, you see what Oculus is doing. They're funding people to put content into their ecosystem in hopes that you'll buy their hardware.
Just for those who don't know, can you just sketch out super briefly what those companies are offering?
I mean, the one I'm closest to is the Valve has put up $100 million fund up to generate content for Steam and to be ported to the HTC Vive, which is, you know, Valve's technology to begin with. So it's, you know, HTC is matched to, I think it's slightly smaller, their incubation fund, and I think I just saw Oculus announce a similar sized fund for content, around $100 million. But, you know, ecosystems are expensive, right? And to get lots of people to adopt your new platform, which doesn't have any users and any clear path for monetization, like, you've got to kind of buy good content makers at the beginning. And so that's really your opportunity is to steal that kind of OEM money and incubate yourself that way, and then maybe prove a model.
Did you say steal? We'll just look past that. Okay, cool. What does success look like right now? You were early in VR. We're early in AR. We haven't had a chance to mature all that much. Is success tons and tons of profit yet? Is it more, you know, learning on the other side, which doesn't have a lot of enterprise value, let's say? You know, where are we? We're eyeball attraction? Where are we in terms of defining success for kind of VR and AR at this early stage?
I think it really depends on which sector you're looking at. I mean, in some sectors, success is, does it work, right? Did it actually do what you wanted it to do? We're early enough, though, that all answers are true, right? Yeah. I mean, success, it's certainly not, did it make a lot of money, right? No one's looking at VR and AR and judging it by its profitability, right? It's not a we're not there. There's not the transaction base. There's not the user base. So it's certainly true that we're not in that part of the ecosystem, or at least that part of the curve of adoption. But when we look at it from our standpoint, we're looking at, is the team credible? Did the product they build do what they hope it's going to do? Are there early signs that there's a there for the kind of content and or experience that they're developing? A year, 2, 5 years from now, very different metrics. But for right now, it's too early to even go that too deep into it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, how many growth rounds have you seen from an AR or VR company, right? There's not a lot of people out there showing significant revenue. I think for us, the metric is revenue. Like, we've got a product launching in 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, and it's about how much of that product can we drive, that adoption of that product, and are we delivering enough ROI, right? If we're delivering enough ROI, scale will come. Scale will come quickly if you do, particularly in the enterprise. So we feel really confident that we're maybe at that inflection point or right about,
Awesome.
at least in industrial or enterprise. There's dollars there for sure to buy these types of solutions. Is the product working? How quickly can you mobilize the teams around it and integrate it into your enterprise? And I think you'll see enterprise adopt AR first. And you'll see those hardware pieces that deliver real value. Really, is, I think, the kind of the first movers, or the first time when you can look at growth and revenue.
I actually definitely agree with that, right? Particularly from the revenue standpoint. I do actually think that we'll all be using some form of AR-ish things on these, right? And there'll be more and more and more and more apps that have us point this thing at the real world and do something. But in terms of where the real dollars will come from in the early days, yeah, enterprise is definitely where we're looking at as well.
Yeah, and I think on the adoption point, I mean, looking at, okay, you've got the big players right now, or from a hardware standpoint, you got HTC, you got Oculus, and you've got the Sony PlayStation VR. PlayStation VR is just being released this month. It'll be really interesting to see what their adoption numbers are out of the gate, because the price points are so different. And if you can get people buying into your system because they already have a PS4 or the new PS4 Pro or whatever they're calling it, and then even if you buy the whole ecosystem together with the headset and the thing, it's still cheaper than buying a HTC plus a computer that can run it. So if PlayStation gets a big influx of people that are using their platform, it's going to make content creators want to create stuff for their platform to better monetize their content. So it's going to be interesting to see where this goes. And I know there are different experiences in terms of the quality of content between the three platforms, but I think over the long run that'll even out. And I think Sony's got a unique opportunity here to kind of be a first mover in terms of adoption. So.
Yeah, I expect them to do quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a pretty nice map of the people who would want to do it and the people who already have the installed PlayStation 4. It's interesting because in some ways, when Blu-ray came out, right, and the decision was, do I go spend $1,000 on a Blu-ray player, or do I spend $399 on a PlayStation 3 that plays a Blu-ray? In some ways, we're in that zone again, where rather than spending $2,000, $3,000 for an HTC, which is pretty awesome and can do all the things that at least are at the cutting edge of VR for right now, I've already spent the money on my PC, right, the PS4, and now maybe I'll spend $400 on the VR. I think that equation works, but it'll have this really interesting effect where location-based systems are going to become in demand, right? In the same way that movie theaters are the best experience you can have in movies, I fully expect that there will be that kind of location-based entertainment model in VR as well, where we will go somewhere to have the peak best kind of experience in VR, at least for a little while, right? Because of the cost differences.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of the things that's so exciting about that is you can introduce consumers to VR in a way that's very low risk and shows them all that's new and exciting about it. And then when it filters down, to a price point that the consumer can afford, you've got lots of people who've tried it. I'm kind of fascinated by the choices that VR and AR companies have to make right now, given sort of the range of configurations. And I hope this isn't getting too down into the weeds, but I mean, you've got some users who want to sit and do seated VR. You've got some users who want to do mobile VR on the go.
Mm-hmm.
You've got some users that want room scale VR, and and so you need different equipment for tracking room scale VR. It's almost hard, I would imagine, to figure out who your audience is, and is this going through the minds of people who are working on AR products and AR VR and AR products and content?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
Definitely. Yeah, it's look, it's akin to when I was looking at mobile when I was at Warner. It's you design it for the thing that you think will have the largest audience for what you want that audience to experience, right? And so, most people don't think about it, but yes, there's one iPhone operating system, and yes, there's Android, but Android is hundreds of devices in various configurations. So it's kind of an analogous problem where you don't just release one game, you release 50 versions of the game if you're trying to blanket the entire market. So we're definitely at that stage where if you are going to create a VR experience or AR experience, you kind of have to choose which segment you go after and what you want them to do. And some of the companies are going to be able to go to least common denominator platforms, right? Some of the companies are going to say, you know what, if the system doesn't have the handholds and haptic feedback, we just don't want to be on it because it's not core to the experience we're creating. So it's going to be different.
Excellent. I'm glad you made the haptic point.
Yeah, I love haptic.
Okay, excellent. So let's talk about revenue in VR and AR right now. You've got a few models. Boy, if you want to find great research, I suppose you can talk to some of the folks up here. You can also look at DigiCapital. I love the research they're coming out with right now.
Okay.
And they mention revenue models like hardware sales, ad spend, in-app purchases, subscriptions, and premium apps. And I just wonder if you're seeing greater success in any of these areas over others, or are there new ones we're not thinking about? What are if you were out right now, where would you be sort of placing your bets to try to squeeze money out of this new market?
I think transaction-based is tough right now unless you're a really good game. Games are the one thing right now that transaction-based the model works, where people pay some sort of a premium for the content. But I think that's unique for gaming itself, and at this juncture.
Yeah, I would also say that we're kind of at the stage where a VR or AR experience is additive to a quote core experience, whatever that might be. So if you're a Hollywood studio and you create a VR experience, you're hoping people go see the movie.
Oh,
right?
so like,
and you're hoping people will download the other products that are associated with it. So I think we're still at the expansion of world stage for the transactional model, more than we are in the app economy stage of it. Right? There's not enough places to go buy it, and not enough people who have the thing to buy it with, to really think about that model yet. The one place I do see it is in hardware. Right? It's when a Caterpillar or a giant oil company buys 400 headsets. That's a pretty nice revenue windfall for that hardware manufacturer. But the reality there is it costs a lot to get there. Right? It costs a lot of R&D and a lot of effort and a lot of sales cycles to get to that place. So it's not about profitability, but the revenue, sure, I think is there.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of the reason that we're focused on enterprise, right? Is the buying paradigms are based on return of investment versus the actual cost of the hardware, right? We're not trying to make a consumer happy. We're trying to remove 4 hours from a 50-hour process. Over time, that is going to more than pay for the cost of the hardware. So we can charge a premium for the hardware, which allows us to do the things that you need to do in AR now, right? You've got to have the best-in-class computer vision. You've got to use expensive processing. You've got to have custom waveguides and different optic patterns that are not cheap and not easy to build. So taking in that cost, it's like early cell phones. Like the first cell phones you saw was a guy on an oil rig with a huge bucket next to him with a phone on it.
That's right.
It's we see it playing out the same way, much in the way that mobile played out, right?
Yeah.
That's how you start it, and eventually those technologies will mature and miniaturize, and they'll be consumer.
Now there is one caveat that says that the adoption path of VR hardware might mean that the transaction basis in VR is going to accelerate quickly. right? So in other words, until there was an iPhone, there was no app economy. Then there was an iPhone, and there were 100,000 apps, right? So there is a faster to scale version for exactly the reasons Mike's talking about. Like it's a very hard problem to solve in AR. I can create kind of a VR fishing game and sell 1 million copies of that and make money, right? So we will see that the next couple of years are probably going to be dominated by those kinds of novelty experiences.
Okay, and I can add that at Axon VR, where I've been beginning to work on deals for the last 6 months, my original vision was that we would try to put a product under every Christmas tree and Hanukkah bush, within a year or two, and get every consumer using it. And it became very clear the cruelty, the viciousness of the consumer ecosystem. The
cruelty.
Yes, when I say I just mean that it's difficult to survive. You need to have a large enough base of users that developers want to make content for it. And in order for developers to want to make content for it, that they need to see the users, and it's you have to bring your price point so low that mass of consumers will purchase these things. So we're opting to sort of not go the consumer route in the short term for those very reasons. I found that fascinating over the last few months. And enterprise is going to be our focus because it's easier right now.
Yeah, it's hard though, right? The sales cycles are longer.
Yeah, that's the one difference.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute about exclusives. So that's one thing that we haven't seen the vicious wars, play themselves out between the platforms to the degree that, one might expect, where Oculus is outspending, HTC or Valve, Sony. Although it's beginning to happen, you're beginning to see some of these exclusives. How does that help or hurt, the consumers and the players involved? What do you think of all this?
Well, it's analogous to the Sony, PlayStation, and Microsoft Xbox situation. Each one has its exclusive properties that drives those hardware sales. It's yet to be determined what that content is going to be. That's going to
the killer
blow
app.
up enough. Yeah, the killer experience that everyone needs to have this device, because if you don't, then you're missing out on the best VR experience out there. But I mean, they're deploying a lot of capital. I mean, I know Oculus has their new $250 million content investment strategy, and that's a lot of money. So I would expect that you could see some bidding wars in the relative near future if it's the right content, if it's the right team producing that, somebody that has experience, that you're going to be able to make something premium enough that is going to have an ROI for you from a hardware sales standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is to the extent that the exclusivities drive the creation of a killer app that drives the adoption of the ecosystem, I think that's healthy. The question is there enough money being spent quickly enough to have enough exclusives, right? So the early indications are yes, right? The early indications are there'll be well over $1 billion in content created, or at least funds that will fund content. It's just, the thing none of us can predict is how quickly is it going to be true that most of us have a VR headset that we're going to pop onto our faces, and we'll want to do that consistently.
Yeah, I mean, you even have to question, does anybody know yet, because of the state of hardware, how long, you can watch TV forever, right? How long can you stay in a VR world, right? How does that create a paradox with content? How do you create content for that world when you don't know what the resting time is to experience it, right? I think that's the killer app thing is still elusive for that reason.
Yeah.
We don't know enough about the hardware yet.
Well, the other side is there just has to be a lot of content because no one wants to do one thing over and over and over again, right? So it's there are a lot of issues tied into this, but your issue is a real one. Like, what is the effect of living in a VR space on our psychology? That's kind of an untapped research area, and for that reason, you'll have guys like Oculus that won't target kids at all, right? Because there's just very little known yet about what that does. But yeah, it's There's a really interesting thing to think about from a social standpoint, which is if it was true that there were people out there that would live in the MMORPGs, the kind of World of Warcraft games, to the exclusion of their real lives, or live in Second Life to the exclusion of their real lives, I can guarantee you there will be people that will live in VR in exclusion to their real lives, right? So that means that there are going to be issues that we're going to have to contend with as a society around VR as it becomes more ubiquitous.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'd say it's that, some sort of game content or something that's serialized. I think we haven't hit that serialized content piece yet in VR. And that's, I think, going to really drive, usage and, monetization there. So,
But I will say, like, with that said, the promise of what VR and AR can bring to us as a global group of humans is pretty amazing. The advancements that it could give us in terms of being able to do things like surgeries better, to be safer on oil rigs, to create much better products, to have experiences that are enabling people to travel to other worlds from their homes, to have classrooms talk about the construction of the Eiffel Tower and watch it being built. I mean, it kind of blows your mind in terms of the endless types of things that are possible in that landscape once you get a lot of creative people who have that in mind creating. But it doesn't take away the fact that every great beneficial technology has a dark side as well.
I mean, you just described why this, all these good people gave up their Tuesday afternoon to come listen to us, because we all believe those things. And so I know I loved when you're saying that, we don't know how long someone can spend in VR. I feel like I'm a one-man study on how many hours a day someone can look down at their phone. And my family of 4, we all do. So if that bodes well, maybe for our tolerance for VR.
Yeah. Arguably, if it's good enough, forever.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. I wouldn't. Yeah. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's happening. And so let's talk for a minute about where this goes. Exits. Consolidation. Like you've got a lot of companies raising money, a lot of good things beginning to happen. Is there going to be, part of this question, I suppose, is a bubble question. Is there going to be sort of a relaxation of the hype and the expansion? Is there going to be consolidation? Must there be with so many platforms coming up? Are companies going to try to stick it out and be independent for the next decade, or are they going to try to sell, like Palmer Luckey did to Facebook? Just what do you think is sort of the coming wave of exits for companies?
Yes to all those. So I'll give you the venture capitalist answer. There will be, without question, large exits in the near term because companies are going to try and catch up to other companies. There will certainly be consolidation from the standpoint of hardware, or at the very least contraction in the standpoint of some aspects of hardware. But on the flip side, there will be all kinds of expansion in new ways to experience those either VR or AR things, right? It's just too early to say what's going to happen, other than to say that all of those things are going to be true. I think we'll have the wave of disillusionment that happens where people say, oh, this is another hyped up thing, and then you'll see valuations drop, you'll see the bigger guys get bigger, and then you'll realize that there actually is a there in VR, and lots of investment will come back into it with some targeted executions. It'll be like any technology wave. With the one caveat that says, because hopefully we're a little bit smarter, having seen mobile adoption, having seen the internet, having seen a bunch of different waves before it, as a venture community, we'll know when the right time is to invest or not invest. But I guess that's the game of venture capital.
Yeah, from our perspective, look, we've Dacry ourselves have done a handful of acquisitions already. I think there's a lot of great technologists out there that it's really hard to survive on without platforms that exist. And being a company that had the ability to acquire these teams and give these folks homes and a platform to build into made a lot of sense, and was a great way for us to acquire talent. I think we're on the verge of that. If you look at every major tech company, they all have AR and VR as part of their growth strategies. So that just signals that at some point they're going to be making acquisitions, or they're going to be looking to jump over each other with whatever tech they can get their hands on. I mean, just if you look at Apple's acquisitions, right, for example, around AR,
that's right.
they've never released an AR product, but they've bought a handful of companies that all signal that they're working on AR. So I think when you know that those guys are in the space and they're investing heavily, I think you can reasonably expect that that there will be opportunities for consolidation in the market in the fairly near future. I'm not saying that we're going to jump into it early next year. There's a lot of room for people to build in hardware and software in the space, but those guys they're watching for sure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think the entire industry is looking after is the kind of unsexy stuff. Like, what are the standards going to be in this thing, right? How are people going to contribute into the ecosystem without having to create an entire vertical ecosystem, right? Because the more that happens, I actually do have concerns that if it doesn't do the things that every other technology has done before, so I'm not that concerned. But if it doesn't go down the path where there are common standards that are cross-platform, there are tool sets that enable us to create the content more efficiently, there are people that have experience in terms of the psychological impacts and others. If those things don't happen, which again, I'm pretty sure there will, you could argue that there's going to be a talent dearth, right? So if we live in a world now where it's easier than ever to start a startup, that necessarily means that there will be more companies than there should be, right? And in other words, anyone who's smart and has a team and ambition will want to start the company. And not everyone should start the company. And frankly, as an ecosystem, in fact, I think that diffusion of the best talent across a lot of companies does one of two things. It creates a lot of great little companies and not enough big companies to make the ecosystem survive. But you know what? We've ridden this wave many times, and we've seen technologies get adopted and transform and standards be developed. So I actually don't have any fear that that's not going to happen.
One hopes that we've learned lessons through former waves, but we never seem to. So I'm curious if anyone has any questions. Let's hear a few. Yes, so in the back, please.
Hi. I know you guys talked a lot about how content creation is kind of, I guess, more of like an afterthought in terms of like an investment perspective. But it seems like in order for this technology to really thrive, you need content creators at the beginning really thinking about how this affects narrative. But it seems as like me pitching my 3VR, my 1AR, and my Snapchat movies to someone seems as untouchable as me pitching my like gangster film to Paramount. So I'm just wondering, it is a Wild West. I think it's for storytellers, it's the most exciting thing to happen to storytelling since like the advent of movies to begin with. But it feels so elusive. Is there any insight on how to like bridge that gap, or do you just have to fill out more submission forms?
Well, so let me let me answer one part of it. Right, we're actually still in the place for VR and AR where it's not true that it's all about the content, right? Because it's right. We're still at the place where putting it on and being in an open field is really cool, right? So if you're in that space, the drive of the industry to tell really great narrative stories isn't quite there, except from our industry, the entertainment industry, right? So if I put my entertainment hat on, that's all we think about, right? We think about what's going to be the narrative story, what is the user, in our case, audience going to experience. But when you talk about the broader ecosystem of investment that's happening in AR and VR, the reason it's not there is because we're still at that stage where it's kind of like the Lumiere brothers projecting onto a wall and the trains coming through, and that was so amazing, right? Like we're still at that place where like these little tiny things are blowing our minds, let alone really deep immersive stories.
I'll give you another more modern analogy. Do you remember when you first saw HD television? And you just like sat on the couch with your family and watched like anthills and dolphins, and it was like, oh, this is wonderful.
Remember Planet Earth?
Right, and then quickly, that kind of subsided, and we said, all right, so now show us sports and tell us stories and do all the great things in HD. And so I think we're coming out. Hopefully, we're coming out of that phase of just being mystified and mesmerized. And so I hope you won't have to fill out too many more submission
Can I
forms.
give you a better answer for you as a content creator though?
Yes.
you need, if you really want to be a storyteller in VR and AR, you have to figure out why that medium is the place to tell that story. You have to figure out what is it about it that when an audience member steps into your world and your narrative, it has to be told there, as opposed to sitting and watching a 3D or 2D screen. If you can solve that, which by the way is an incredibly hard problem, then at some point in the not too distant future, you will be a very sought after person, right? Because that is the hardest part to solve in the content side.
If I might contribute to this conversation, I work for a company called WorldBiz.
Sure.
And we've been doing content for enterprise for 10 years. Content is hard for me to scale. I sell solutions, right? The cameras, the HMDs, everything. Somebody needs to say, I'm doing a PTSD study and I need to go and have this art that does this. So I have to go and fund that. I have to get that done, whether it's internally or something else. So whether it's a VC or somebody who's going to pay that bill. There's a great wealth of people who need that content created, and they're story arcs, and there are things you can go and do. So if you can find a match,
So there's a market.
Yeah, that's
There's
a really
needs
good
to
point,
make
right?
the market.
So like VCs are going to look for scale points. They're going to say, oh, if you could sell 5,000 cameras instead of 2,000 cameras, you'll do better, right? And so it's why it naturally goes to platforms and tools and technologies. But if you're a studio with really great characters, you're thinking about where those characters can live that are relevant to audiences. And so if you go to those same places, right, to your analogy, if you go to the people who have need for storytellers and pitch them a way to tell your story, or their story really, in this new world, I think that is the first version of what's going to work. I think it would be very hard to tell completely original IP in this space for a little while, just because there's just not enough users. So if you've raised $1 million and you create the first VR movie experience, you might have people that watch it out of novelty, but there's just not enough audience there. But if you were to, put Mickey Mouse in a VR, or even better, like if you put Princess Aurora in a place where my daughter can strap in and talk to her for an hour, I'll buy that, right? Like there's no question I'll pay for that. So like if you're thinking about like as a content creator, what could I do to get myself in and experiment and do stuff, we're still there where the brands need help. And if you have credibility in that space, I think you could do well.
So we'll get to some of the other questions in a second. Please hold
Sorry,
them
I
up.
don't mean to
He had
dominate.
his
No,
hand
no,
up,
that's
yeah.
fine.
I guess I had a question,
Yeah.
and this is tied into what you were saying earlier about standards developing, but specifically with VR, you have this intense performance challenge, which suggests to me that if you're making, say, libraries for people to fold into your app, you can't just, as happened in the web world, where you can just throw in a bunch of stuff and there's not that big a performance issue, you can't just throw things in. You really need source code, right? And oftentimes that's against like protecting
Yeah.
your IP. And on the AR side, you've got this slightly different issue of you don't want to keep changing apps. You kind of want a seamless world and to be able to.
The world is your app.
Yeah, the world is your app, and how do you essentially contextually pull up the right app, or how do you give your source code so that you can contribute to this world? And I'm wondering if any of y'all have bumped into folks who are actively sort of solving the monetization and funding problems behind this.
Well, I'll answer it this way, because I think what you're getting at is where is the ecosystem scale going to come from? In a kind of roundabout sort of way. Like it's
With the source out there, just everything.
Yeah, well, so venture capitalists are looking for those platforms that are going to get adopted, right? It's things like Unity that are the guts of game engines and systems, right? That analogy holds true for this sector as it does for the game sector. And there are companies out there that are trying to be that, right? They're trying to be the tool set that you use to create your VR experiences. They're trying to be the camera rig and post-production facility that you use to make it easier to shoot it and then edit it. They're certainly trying to be the app store of that universe, and so yeah, they're the same analogies that are that make the iPhone an ecosystem or Android ecosystem, Google Play Store work are happening in VR as well. It's just that there aren't enough endpoints yet to know which one of those are going to win. So we're a little bit away from there being this kind of utopic 1 or 2 or 3 systems that everybody uses to generate, right? There's still enough smart people trying to create really cool cameras or really cool rigs and are all kind of climbing the mountain in different paths. And so if you're an IP holder looking down the mountain at all these people coming up to help you, it's really difficult to pick which one of these guys are going to work. So you pick some and you pilot. If you're a venture capitalist at the bottom of the mountain looking up at who's going to win, you're kind of seeing like this team looks like they have traction in this space and maybe that ecosystem works. And so you're making bets on pattern recognition against what's happening. But none of us could with a straight face tell you that this will win, right? So there's still a gap between the people that can put content into the ecosystem and the people that are building up the platforms and where they're going to meet, right?
Yeah, look for business opportunities. Behind, well, I'll get you next.
Hi. We see reports that the VR/AR industry is supposed to be $180 billion by 2025. So what part of it you think will be pure content?
You mean how much of 180 will be spent on just...
Content, that's one.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to find out, I really want to ask you all is, who do you think will be the earliest adopters of VR and AR content? Is it going to be the manufacturing industry, education, medical? Who is going to be the earliest or the biggest adopters of content in VR and AR?
So on the content side, the early indications are that the game community is the one that maps closest. And then follow, obviously, the industrial side of it, right, in terms of just the use cases. To answer your question about content dollars, though, it's really difficult, right? It's and if you look at all the people that are trying to forecast out the dollars, they all have different answers, because it's tough to predict. Like, how do you predict the transaction basis on something that's not there yet? You have to predict how big that there is going to be, and then predict transaction on top of that. So there's multiple layers of assumptions. I could tell you any answer you want, right? I could literally model it out and mix up the variables and tell you an answer, but it's not.
I'll give you an
it's not quite
example,
there yet.
right? Think about it this way. So Daiquiri builds a HUD, an automobile HUD.
Mhm.
It's an augmented reality HUD. It's in 200,000 cars right now.
Mhm.
It is right now the most widely distributed AR device there is. Right, when you think about it in those terms, and now think about the average commute time of a human being is 45 minutes in the U.S. The amount of time they're spending in front of AR every day, right? Where is the biggest adoption of AR going to be? It's probably not the factory floor. It's probably not Pokemon Go. It's probably in your automobile.
I think that's right.
So there's
that's
conventional
absolutely
wisdom
right.
that it's the gamers playing the games, but there's also less conventional wisdom that there's surprising more practical
Yeah.
applications every day.
But you were asking a different question, right? You were asking, when does somebody choose to experience my content?
Correct. And do you think in by 5-6 years, actually content companies will be able to get an ROI?
So that's a good question. Let me ask you to take that offline so we can get to a few more folks. You can ask folks after. Let's see. So you were next, and we've got plenty back there. Yes.
When it comes again to content and dealing with this on the world level, because you had mentioned China, there's a lot of users in China. Do you find it's all gaming in every country here in America or in China? Because specifically China is a huge market. And so what kind of content do you find is very popular in China compared to the difference in here?
Specifically in VR and AR?
Yes.
No, it does actually run the gamut. I mean, yes, games are there, but they also have things like visit the local sites kind of experiences, the more kind of theme parky experiences, right? Like the Void, right? Things like that are going to be popular there, we know, just based on research. But look, I don't want to say that gamers are the only opportunity, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that. Well, so
Social
that's
VR.
actually a really good point. Like I do think that there's a world for social VR. There's certainly a world for the more kind of utilitarian things in our lives. The how do I get to the store? How do I buy milk? They're definitely going to, the car example is fantastic, right? I 100% agree that cars look to be the very first and really interesting at-scale platforms for these kinds of connected AR experiences that heretofore have been really kind of relegated to the phone. So I do think that there's going to be a there for that kind of content. But if you're talking about narrative storytelling versus I'm playing a game versus I'm interacting with some piece of content that we in Hollywood tend to think of creating, then it looks like the game community is going to adopt those experiences first. But those same communities really love watching movies and watching TV shows. So there will be something in that world that makes sense. It may not look like the sitcoms we're used to seeing, right? And it may not be the same kind of narrative structure that we're used to thinking about in films. But I mean, I've seen some VR movies that are really good movies. Like there's this great space invasion movie that puts you kind of in the heart of this invaders coming in, and so there are things like that that are already being developed. So you could imagine a world where, and this is true of Chinese markets, right? Chinese markets tend to really love the big effects driven, high plot, high dramatic moment kinds of pieces of content. It's why movies like Pacific Rim work well there. It's why World of Warcraft did really well there. So, and that's not a ubiquitous statement. I don't want to say that they don't like comedies and dramas either, but in VR you can make those spectacles really novel experiences. So I would expect that there will be cases like that that do well.
Uh,
I was interested in your assertion about the multiplicity of small companies versus larger companies building the ecosystem. And I mean, we had such a flush of investment, especially in 2015, in relatively small companies. I know of one example of what we would call it, if you want to look backwards, the roll-up strategy, where people recognize that the runway will run out for 2015, and those companies may not be able to do another round, but they may actually be able to consolidate. Do you see that? Are you getting pitched that way? Do you see a consolidation literally imminent among smaller companies?
Not to the extent you're talking about, right? Because you're talking about private equity companies coming in and talking to VCs and swooping up large swath of businesses. We're still a little early for that. It's frankly, we don't know if there's a company that's tiny now that's going to grow into Facebook, right? Like, and I mean by market size. I don't mean by the actual social VR thing. So it's not quite there. But if your question is in just the general sense, will that happen? There's no doubt, right? And you said it best. Like, there are already VR companies buying other VR companies.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So we've been building our studio up till now because there's not much of an audience based on project financing through like marketing budget. We did the Lionsgate, Allegiant, and John Wick thing.
Cool.
And we were lucky enough to sell an original title to Google for Daydream, so we've done strategic a bit. But now we're looking to grow the studio more. My question is really about valuation. When we talk to people about money now, they always want to ask us, okay, what's your valuation? I go, well, we've done this and this, and we have this many people, and we know how to build this stuff. Whatever you say. This,
Yeah.
on the AR side, the only thing you can compare to is Pokemon Go, and that's pipe dream. So how do you think of the valuation?
In
Can I-
VR, you just look them in
can
the
I
eye
give
and
you a
say,
really
it's
kind
this
of-
number.
Yeah, I mean, the blanket answer for valuation is there are ways in which you can justify valuations, but at the end of the day, the valuation is a negotiation between you and the person who is trying to agree or disagree with you, right? And so, venture capitalists try to use metrics to get to some kind of valuation number, most oftentimes things like profitability or revenue growth, users, some proxy for how big and valuable your company will be. But the reality is, if you have an idea of what you're worth in mind, figure out how you justify that, right? And convince them. No, literally, that is absolutely true. I mean, you can use. Look, we live in a world where a lot of people don't kind of appreciate this, but like once upon a time, venture capital was like a black box. Like nobody knew it existed. Like it was impossible to find funding rounds or who funded what and what. But now things like Crunchbase and all the various ways you can find this information out, you could probably find 10 companies that have proxy-like raises against the business you already have, and probably create a pretty convincing argument for why you're worth X. Now, be prepared.
Kind of doing comparables now.
Yeah.
It feels like
Just be prepared for the venture capitalists to use the same tools against you, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, it's like real estate.
Yeah, it's hard.
Well,
In
that's
the-
my fault.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Valuation is hard. It's the hardest part of venture
Even for
capital.
people who are used to projects.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're making revenue, it's a lot easier. I can multiply you out and tell you how much you're worth. But
Talk about Pixar.
So,
Pixar. What about Pixar?
That's what I would do. Talk about Pixar.
oh.
Oh.
How about Magic Leap? Just use Magic
Yeah,
Leap.
that's a little
They're
hard.
even better. In the back.
What about Pixar?
So to the point earlier about whether you're ever going to have a Facebook type of a company in this space, I mean, if you look at engagement metrics, maybe with the limitations on spending time in a VR
Yeah.
experience, maybe separate out VR and AR for the moment. In VR itself, it almost seems like that's a foregone conclusion that you'll never get to a Facebook-like valuation for anybody because of.
Why do you say that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you just talking about VR in particular?
VR in particular.
I think it's too hard to say that. I mean, we're at the Friendster stage of social media, right? It's literally like too early.
Talking about its upper limit. I mean, if you look at Facebook and the amount of time people spend on Facebook, and you look at VR and say, well, you're not going to be able to spend.
Well, no.
14 hours.
Let me
do this. I'm curious. I think we've got a couple of people in the audience that want to answer that, who want to respond to that. Let's bring in the audience perspective. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is it's too early, and the upper limit hasn't been reached, because we don't have the content yet, and we don't have HMDs that have better performance and better price points. And in
Yeah.
addition, there's a lot of things in that answer that you haven't totally, no offense, taken into account, such as the fact, kind of that I've seen anecdotally in my journey in VR the past years, that the younger you go, the younger a person is when they put, this is just something I found, the younger a person is, the less VR seat legs they have, which means hypothetically they could spend longer inside of an HMD if the experience and the content is right. So the idea that like it's a one and done conclusion, that we've hit the upper limit, it just seems a little bit presumptuous, particularly because we haven't, the market
Okay.
hasn't even saturated middle
Yeah.
America or the West yet. I mean,
So
it's
it's
way
a
too early.
fair point. In the front, another comment?
Yeah, well, just piggybacking on that, you can argue in a way that for a lot of people who spend hours a day on Facebook, that is their virtual reality. You know, these are some people they've never met in real life and they're forming friendships. So if there would be some kind of VR app that would allow them to have those same virtual experiences with, say, the really cool kids, you know, I see how that could be explosive.
Can I answer it in this way? So when I was thinking about 3D, back when 3D was the hyped up new tech, it was really difficult for me to have multiple models that really needed 3D from a utilitarian standpoint. VR is not like that, right? And by extension, AR as well. Because the way I would answer your question is, literally anything you do in a day, you could probably do in a virtual environment. And if that's true, and the technology gets good enough to do that, then there is no upper bound. Because you could literally wake up in VR, live your entire life in VR, and go to sleep in VR. So that, right, like think about it, like you don't have to go to work, your office is there. You don't have to go to the meeting is there. You don't have to eat, you Uber Eats it and it shows up, and you don't even have to see what you're eating because in the VR landscape you're eating it. Like I mean, like
You're saying these
you
things
could
like they're a good
literally
thing.
do everything. Like you could literally do everything. And if that's true, if it's true that you could literally do everything, and there's an endless amount of platform extension, meaning there's industrial, there's healthcare, there's communication, there's gaming, there's socializing, there's all of the things that we as human beings do. Because yeah, let me take it one step further, which is the we're living in a simulation universe anyway argument. Like so I was
Has
a
everyone
neuroscientist.
heard this? Can you explain
right?
what this is?
So what this is so I was a neuroscientist. I studied the brain. The brain is encased in this body. This body is just a collection of sensors and haptic feedbacks and visual displays and everything else that the brain is interpreting to say is real, right? VR is kind of the same thing. VR, if the VR experience gets good enough, and there's a big giant if, and maybe we're 200 years away from this universe where the Star Trek holodeck exists, but you can kind of start to extrapolate out that the same kind of upper bounds that exist in Facebook, because I can't do everything I want to do in my life, arguably yet. Now give Facebook 100 years, and I guarantee you can, right? So I wouldn't, that's my answer to you. It's not that the engagement metrics are too early, although I do agree 100% it is too early. It's more that you can literally imagine doing anything in VR. And if you can imagine doing anything in VR, at some point in time, some company is going to let you do that.
I recommend reading Ready Player One if you haven't,
yeah.
or just waiting for the Spielberg version to come out.
Yeah,
So.
but sorry, I didn't answer your question. So what, the we're living in a simulation world. There's a collection of
you know
pretty high-powered VCs that think maybe we
Unfortunately,
are.
I hate to say it, Kevin. I'm really
Yeah.
sorry. We're kind of over time.
good.
I'd love to hear that, and maybe if you want to hear it, come ask him afterward. I think I'm just going to have time for one last quick question, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a comment, actually. I would say that I think the real limiting factor for VR currently is cost. So you look at Facebook, the reason they were able to grow so quickly and get so many users because it's free. And you look at Apple, the biggest challenge they faced was being able to put an iPhone in the hands of everyone for basically free. So you look at what Sony did with with Blu-ray, where they were actually losing money when they put it out, to get it into more people's homes. With Oculus, it's such an expensive price point that it's very difficult for most people to get, and that's gonna really be what limits them right now until they can figure out a way to make it cheap and make more people have it in the home.
Yeah.
I think.
That's
That's
well put.
kinda
That's
true.
well put. You know, guys, it's after 5. You've been a great audience. Please help me thank our panelists today.